The glass shattered against the marble floor before Edward even understood why his hand was shaking. He stood frozen in the hallway of his own estate, the sound still echoing off the high ceilings, and for a moment he could not remember what had frightened him more, the crash of the crystal or the silence that followed it. Vivian appeared at the doorway behind him, wrapped in a silk robe, her face pale with confusion. She asked him what was wrong, but Edward could not answer. His eyes were fixed on a folded paper someone had slipped under the door only minutes earlier, a paper he had not yet dared to touch. He had come to this house, as he always did on Thursday evenings, to escape the weight of his title and the coldness he believed had settled over his marriage. Charlotte, his wife, was 7 months into her pregnancy, and lately she had grown quiet in a way that unsettled him more than any argument could. He had told himself it was simply exhaustion, the natural tiredness of carrying a child, and he had used that excuse to justify slipping away more often than he should have. Vivian's house had become his refuge, a place where no one asked him difficult questions, and no one looked at him the way Charlotte sometimes did, as though she already knew something he had not yet confessed. He bent down and picked up the paper with fingers that would not stay steady. It bore the seal of a law office he recognized instantly, one of the most respected firms in the city, a firm his own family had used for generations. His stomach tightened before he even broke the seal. Vivian moved closer, trying to read over his shoulder, but he stepped away instinctively, as though putting distance between her and the letter could undo whatever it contained. The first line alone was enough to make the room tilt around him. His wife, Charlotte Barlow, Duchess of the Whitmore estate, had filed for divorce. The words on the page were formal, precise, without a trace of anger, which somehow made them more frightening than if she had screamed at him in person. There was no accusation of infidelity in the letter itself, no dramatic declaration of betrayal. It simply stated facts, dates, and legal terms, as though she had transformed her heartbreak into something clean and undeniable, something that could not be argued away with charm or apology. Edward's mind raced back through the months, searching for the exact moment things had begun to unravel. He thought of the nights he had claimed to be working late at the estate office, when in truth he had been here, in Vivian's parlor, laughing over wine and pretending his other life did not exist. He thought of the small gifts he had given Vivian, jewelry he had told Charlotte was for a business associate's wife, when in fact it had been for the woman standing beside him now, watching him unravel in real time. He read further, and his hands began to tremble even more violently. Charlotte had not only filed for divorce, she had included a letter of her own, separate from the legal documents, written in her own hand. Edward recognized her handwriting immediately, elegant and controlled, the same handwriting that used to fill his letters with warmth and affection when they were first courting. Now that same handwriting carried a different weight entirely. Vivian asked again what the paper said, her voice sharper this time, laced with something close to fear. Edward did not answer her. He walked past her without a word, out through the front hall, down the stone steps, into the cool evening air, still holding the letter as though it might change if he looked away and looked back. He needed silence. He needed to think. He needed to understand how his wife, a woman he had always believed too gentle and too trusting to ever confront him directly, had somehow outmaneuvered him so completely. He thought back to the early days of their marriage, when Charlotte had been the picture of quiet devotion. She had never questioned his absences, never demanded explanations for his late nights, never so much as raised her voice when he came home smelling faintly of perfume that was not hers. He had mistaken her silence for ignorance. He realized now, standing in the cold with the letter crumpling slightly in his grip, that her silence had never been ignorance at all. It had been patience. It had been observation. It had been the slow, careful gathering of a case she intended to win without ever raising her voice. He remembered a conversation from weeks earlier, when he had barely registered at the time. Charlotte had asked him almost casually whether he still loved her the way he had when they first married. He had laughed it off, kissed her forehead, and told her not to be foolish, that pregnancy was making her sentimental. She had smiled at him then, a small, unreadable smile, and said nothing more. Now that smile replayed in his mind with a different meaning entirely. She had already known. She had already decided. She had simply been waiting for the right moment to act, and she had chosen it with devastating precision, timing the delivery of the papers to arrive exactly when he was in the one place he thought was safe from her reach. Vivian came out onto the steps behind him, arms crossed against the evening chill, and asked him directly whether his wife knew about her. Edward turned to look at her, and for the first time since they had begun seeing each other, he saw not affection in her eyes but calculation, a quiet assessment of what this scandal might mean for her own reputation. It struck him then how quickly the warmth between them could turn cold the moment real consequences arrived at the door. He did not answer her question. He simply asked her to give him a moment alone, and to his mild surprise, she did not argue. He sat down on the stone steps, the letter still in his hand, and finally allowed himself to read the personal note Charlotte had included beneath the legal language. Her words were not cruel. They were worse than cruel because they were honest. She wrote that she had known for months, that she had chosen not to confront him because she wanted to be certain, not out of doubt in her own instincts, but out of respect for the truth. She wrote that she had used the quiet months of her pregnancy not to grieve but to prepare, to consult with people who could help her protect herself and her unborn child, regardless of what he decided to do next. She wrote that she was not asking him to explain himself, because she already understood everything she needed to understand. The final lines of her letter were the ones that made his chest tighten most painfully. She wrote that she still remembered the man he used to be before his title and his comfort made him careless with the people who loved him, and that she hoped, for his own sake, he would someday remember that man too. There was no plea in her words, no desperation, only a calm finality that told him this decision had already been made long before the papers reached him. She was not asking for his response. She was informing him of hers. Edward sat there for a long time, the city lights beginning to flicker on in the distance, and he realized with a cold clarity that he had underestimated his wife in nearly every way a man could underestimate another person. He had assumed her gentleness was weakness. He had assumed her silence was submission. He had assumed that no matter what he did, she would remain exactly where he left her, waiting patiently for him to return home whenever he chose to. Instead, she had spent months quietly building a life that no longer required his presence at all, and she had done it without him noticing a single sign. He thought of their unborn child, a life that would soon enter the world into the middle of this collapse, and something inside him shifted uncomfortably, a feeling he did not immediately recognize because he had rarely allowed himself to feel it fully. It was shame, sharp and sudden, arriving far too late to change anything that had already been set into motion. He looked back at the house behind him, at Vivian standing in the doorway with her arms still crossed, and he understood that whatever this relationship had been, it had never been worth what he was about to lose. He stood up slowly, his legs unsteady beneath him, and made a decision that surprised even himself. He would not call Charlotte. He would not send a message asking her to reconsider. Instead, he would go home, not to plead or to argue, but simply to see her face when he told her he understood exactly why she had done what she had done. He did not yet know if that would be enough, or if it even mattered anymore, but for the first time in months, he felt the pull of something real, something urgent, something that could not be postponed any longer. The letter had done exactly what she must have intended it to do. It had stripped away every excuse he had built for himself, and left him standing alone with nothing but the truth. As he walked toward his car, his phone buzzed in his pocket. He almost ignored it, assuming it was Vivian calling from the house behind him, but something told him to check. The name on the screen was not Vivian's. It was his estate manager, Alfred, calling at an hour he never usually called. Edward answered, his voice barely steady, and the words on the other end of the line made his blood run cold all over again. Charlotte had already left the estate. Nobody knew exactly where she had gone, only that she had taken a small bag, her personal documents, and had been driven away by her brother Henry less than an hour earlier. She had left no note, no forwarding address, nothing but the papers that were now trembling in Edward's hand. He stood frozen on the dark street outside Vivian's house, the letter crumpled tightly in his fist, and understood with sudden, devastating clarity that the woman he had spent years underestimating had already moved 3 steps ahead of him, and he had no idea where she had gone, or whether she would ever let him find her again. Edward drove through the dark streets faster than he should have, his knuckles white against the steering wheel, his mind replaying Alfred's words over and over. Charlotte was gone. Not upstairs sulking, not visiting her mother for the evening, but gone, with a bag packed and her brother driving her away from the only home she had known since their wedding. He had expected many reactions from her over the years, tears, silence, even distance, but never this. Never a clean, deliberate departure that left him standing outside another woman's house holding proof of his own downfall. When he reached the estate, the halls felt unnaturally still. Alfred met him at the door, his expression carefully neutral in the way of a man trained for decades to hide his true feelings from his employer. Edward asked him directly where Charlotte had gone, and Alfred admitted he did not know, only that she had seemed calm the entire time, almost cheerful, which unsettled Edward more than tears would have. A woman preparing to fight for her marriage cries. A woman preparing to leave it altogether plans quietly and walks out with her head high. He went to her bedroom first, half expecting to find some clue, a note tucked beneath a pillow, a diary left open to a revealing page. Instead, he found the room exactly as it always was, tidy, untouched, as though she had not needed to disturb a single object to take what mattered most to her. Her jewelry box sat closed on the dresser. Her wedding ring, however, was missing from its usual place beside the mirror. Edward stared at the empty spot for a long moment, trying to decide what it meant that she had taken the ring with her rather than leaving it behind as a symbolic gesture. He did not know whether it meant she still valued what it represented, or whether she simply intended to sell it once the divorce was finalized. He called her phone, but it went straight to a message stating the number was no longer in service. He tried her brother Henry next, a man who had never fully trusted Edward and had made no secret of his reservations before the wedding. Henry answered on the second ring, his voice flat and controlled. He told Edward that Charlotte was safe, that she was with people who cared about her, and that she had specifically asked not to be contacted for the time being. Edward pressed him for more information, his voice rising with a desperation he rarely allowed himself to show. But Henry simply repeated that Charlotte needed space, and ended the call before Edward could argue further. Sleep did not come that night. Edward sat in his study long after midnight, the divorce papers spread across his desk beside Charlotte's personal letter, reading her words again and again, as though repetition might reveal some hidden invitation to reconcile. Instead, each reading only confirmed what he had begun to understand on the steps outside Vivian's house. Charlotte had not written this letter in a moment of heartbreak. She had written it with the clarity of someone who had already grieved the marriage privately, over weeks or perhaps months, and had emerged from that grief with a plan rather than a wound. The following morning, a car arrived at the estate that Edward had not requested. A man in a formal gray suit stepped out, introducing himself as Grant Coleman, the lawyer representing Charlotte in the divorce proceedings. Edward recognized the name from the seal on the letter the night before. Coleman was polite but entirely unmoved by Edward's attempts at charm, the same charm that had smoothed over countless business dealings and social embarrassments throughout his life. Coleman explained, in measured and professional language, that Charlotte had retained his services nearly 4 months earlier, well before her pregnancy had become physically obvious to those outside the family. Edward felt something cold settle in his chest at the timeline. 4 months. That meant she had begun preparing for this outcome long before he had believed their marriage was in any real danger. He asked Coleman directly whether Charlotte had mentioned any specific incident that had triggered her decision, some final piece of evidence that had convinced her beyond doubt. Coleman remained diplomatically vague, stating only that his client had been thorough in documenting the circumstances of her marriage, and that any further discussion of specifics would need to happen through proper legal channels rather than in casual conversation on his front steps. Before leaving, Coleman handed Edward a folder containing the full scope of the divorce filing. Edward's hands were steadier now than they had been the previous night, but what he read inside that folder still managed to unsettle him deeply. Charlotte was not simply asking for a standard separation of assets. She had structured the filing to ensure that regardless of the outcome, the child she carried would be financially protected through a trust that Edward could not access or influence, managed entirely through independent trustees rather than through the Whitmore family estate. She had anticipated every possible maneuver Edward might attempt, and had closed each door before he even realized it existed. Edward's mother, Margaret, arrived at the estate later that same afternoon, having heard the news through the rapid network of social connections that always seemed to carry scandal faster than official announcements ever could. She did not offer him comfort. Instead, she sat across from him in the drawing room with an expression of quiet disappointment that reminded him uncomfortably of his own childhood, of the many times he had been caught in smaller deceptions and made to sit through her silent judgment before any words were spoken. Margaret asked him plainly whether the rumors were true, whether he had indeed been unfaithful to Charlotte during her pregnancy. Edward considered lying, out of old habit more than any real hope of success, but something in his mother's gaze told him she already knew the answer and was only testing whether he had grown enough as a man to admit it honestly. He confirmed it, his voice quieter than he intended, and watched his mother's expression shift from disappointment to something closer to grief. She told him a story he had never heard before, about his own father, a man Edward had always remembered as devoted and reliable, a pillar of quiet strength throughout Edward's childhood. Margaret revealed that his father had also strayed once, many years earlier, and that she had nearly left him over it, drafting her own departure in secret before eventually choosing to stay, though the marriage was never quite the same afterward. She told Edward this not to excuse his behavior, but to warn him that Charlotte's calm exterior did not mean she was still deciding. In her experience, when a woman reached the point of filing paperwork rather than raising her voice, the decision had already been made long before the papers were ever printed. Edward asked his mother directly whether she believed there was any way to win Charlotte back. Margaret did not answer immediately. She studied her son for a long moment, as though trying to determine whether the man in front of her had genuinely changed or was simply frightened of losing his comfortable life. Eventually she told him that if he truly wanted a chance at reconciliation, he would need to stop thinking about winning Charlotte back, and start thinking about who he needed to become regardless of whether she ever returned to him at all. It was, she said, the only version of him that might actually deserve a second chance, and the only version that had any hope of raising his child well if Charlotte chose not to forgive him. That evening, Edward attempted to reach Charlotte through every channel he could think of. He called her closest friends, most of whom refused to answer or gave vague, unhelpful responses clearly coached by someone protecting her location. He drove to her mother's old family home in the countryside, only to find it locked and dark, no sign that anyone had stayed there recently. He even considered hiring someone to track her location through her phone records, a thought he dismissed almost immediately with a flash of shame, recognizing it as exactly the kind of controlling behavior that had likely contributed to the distance between them in the first place. Vivian called him twice during those difficult hours, her messages growing increasingly frustrated as he continued to ignore them. When he finally answered on the third attempt, her tone had shifted entirely from the warmth he remembered to something sharper, almost accusatory. She asked him what this meant for their relationship going forward, whether he intended to fight for his marriage or move forward with her instead. Edward found himself unable to answer with any conviction, and in the silence that followed, he understood that whatever Vivian had represented to him over the past several months, comfort, escape, admiration, none of it carried the weight he had once believed it did, especially not now that the real consequences of his choices were unfolding around him in ways he could no longer ignore or postpone. He ended the call without providing the answer she wanted, and sat alone in his study once more, staring at the small ultrasound photograph Charlotte had given him months earlier, back when their marriage still felt whole. He traced the faint outline of the child in the image with his fingertip, and for the first time since the papers had arrived at Vivian's door, he allowed himself to cry, not out of self-pity, but out of the sudden, overwhelming realization that he might have already lost the only two people whose love had never asked anything from him except honesty, something he had failed repeatedly to provide. Late that night, his phone rang once more. It was an unfamiliar number, but something told him to answer it. On the other end was a nurse from a private medical clinic on the outskirts of the city, informing him in careful, professional tones that Charlotte had been admitted earlier that evening due to unexpected complications with her pregnancy, and that given the seriousness of her condition, the medical staff believed her husband should be informed immediately, regardless of the personal circumstances between them. Edward was in his car before the nurse had even finished speaking, his heart pounding with a fear far greater than anything the divorce papers had caused him, because for the first time that entire day, he understood with absolute clarity that some losses could not be negotiated, reconsidered, or reversed with charm, money, or apology, no matter how sincerely they were offered. The private clinic's corridor felt impossibly long as Edward half ran toward the reception desk, his coat still unbuttoned, his breath ragged from the drive. He gave Charlotte's name to the nurse behind the counter, his voice cracking in a way that startled him, and was told to wait in a small side room while the doctors finished their assessment. He did not sit down. He paced the narrow space, his mind spinning through every possible outcome, none of them acceptable, all of them terrifying in their own particular way. Henry appeared in the doorway a few minutes later, his expression a mixture of exhaustion and barely restrained anger. He told Edward flatly that he had not wanted to call him, that Charlotte herself had asked, in a moment of weakness brought on by fear and pain, whether someone should let her husband know. Henry made it clear that this concession did not mean forgiveness, and that the moment Charlotte was stable, Edward would need to respect whatever distance she chose to maintain. Edward nodded, too consumed with worry to argue, and asked instead what had actually happened. Henry explained that Charlotte had experienced sudden, severe pain shortly after arriving at the small rented apartment she had taken temporarily on the edge of the city, a place Edward had never known existed. She had been rushed to the clinic by a neighbor after nearly collapsing in the hallway. The doctors suspected a complication related to elevated blood pressure, a condition that could become dangerous quickly if left unmanaged, especially this late in a pregnancy. Henry's voice wavered slightly as he admitted that the doctors had used words like premature delivery and had not yet ruled out more serious risks to either Charlotte or the child. A doctor finally emerged, a composed woman named Dr. Whitfield, who addressed both men with the practiced calm of someone accustomed to delivering uncertain news to frightened families. She explained that Charlotte's blood pressure had spiked to a concerning level, a condition sometimes linked to stress, exhaustion, and the physical strain of late pregnancy combined together. They were monitoring both mother and child closely, and while the situation was serious, it was not yet at the point of requiring immediate delivery. Rest, calm, and careful management over the coming days would determine whether the pregnancy could continue safely toward full term. Edward asked, his voice barely above a whisper, whether he could see her. Dr. Whitfield hesitated, glancing briefly at Henry before answering that Charlotte had been informed of his arrival and had agreed to allow a short visit, though she cautioned that emotional strain of any kind could worsen her condition, and asked Edward to remain composed regardless of what was said between them. Edward promised he would, though he was not entirely certain he could keep that promise once he was standing in front of her. The room was dim when he entered, lit only by the soft glow of monitoring equipment beside the bed. Charlotte lay propped against a stack of pillows, her face pale but her eyes alert, watching him with an expression he could not immediately read. He approached slowly, unsure whether to sit, whether to reach for her hand, whether any gesture of comfort would even be welcome given everything that had happened between them in the last day. He settled for standing quietly beside the bed, waiting for her to speak first. Charlotte's voice, when it finally came, was steady despite her physical weakness. She told him she had not asked for him to be here out of any renewed affection, but because the doctors had insisted that in situations involving legal guardianship of an unborn child, both parents should be aware of significant medical developments, regardless of the state of their marriage. She made it clear, gently but firmly, that her request for his presence tonight was not an invitation to reconcile, and she asked him not to mistake it for one. Edward absorbed her words carefully, resisting the urge to argue or plead, remembering his mother's warning from earlier that day. Instead, he simply asked how she was feeling and whether there was anything she needed. Charlotte studied him for a long moment, as though surprised by the restraint in his tone, before admitting quietly that she was frightened, not of the divorce or the scandal that would surely follow once society learned of it, but of the possibility that stress and complications might harm the child she had already grown to love fiercely over the past 7 months. He asked her carefully why she had chosen to leave so suddenly, without giving him any chance to speak or explain himself. Charlotte's expression hardened slightly, though her voice remained calm. She told him that she had given him countless chances to speak honestly over the past several months, small moments where she had gently opened the door to conversation, hoping he would walk through it and admit what she already suspected. Each time, he had chosen comfortable lies instead, and each lie had confirmed for her that honesty was not something he was capable of offering unless forced into a corner with undeniable proof in front of him. She reached toward the small table beside her bed and withdrew a slim folder, handing it to him without further explanation. Edward opened it hesitantly and found inside a series of photographs, receipts, and printed messages, evidence Charlotte had collected patiently over several months with the quiet, methodical determination he had completely failed to notice beneath her calm exterior. There were photographs of him entering and leaving Vivian's residence at various hours, dated and time-stamped. There were copies of restaurant receipts for meals he had claimed were business dinners. There were even printed records of gifts purchased under names Edward had used to disguise their true recipient. He felt his stomach twist as he flipped through page after page, each one a small, precise nail in the coffin of every excuse he had ever offered her. Charlotte watched his reaction without visible satisfaction or anger, simply observing him with the same detached patience that had apparently allowed her to compile this entire record without him ever suspecting a thing. She told him that she had not gathered this evidence out of a desire for revenge, but because she had learned, through painful experience, that a woman entering a legal battle without proof was a woman who could easily be dismissed, discredited, or manipulated by someone with far greater resources and social standing than she possessed. Edward closed the folder slowly, his hands trembling again, though this time from a different kind of fear entirely, the fear of a man finally confronting the full weight of his own failures rather than being allowed to minimize them. He asked her, his voice raw, whether there was truly nothing he could say or do that might change her mind. Charlotte's eyes softened slightly, though her resolve did not waver. She told him that she did not hate him, and that she hoped, for the sake of their child, that he would eventually become a father worth respecting. But that respect and forgiveness were not the same thing as remaining married to someone who had shown her repeatedly that her trust meant little to him. A soft alarm from the monitoring equipment interrupted their conversation, and a nurse hurried in to check Charlotte's vital signs, gently reminding Edward that the visit needed to end soon to avoid further strain. Charlotte closed her eyes briefly, clearly exhausted, and Edward realized with a pang of guilt that even this conversation, calm and controlled as it had been, had likely cost her more energy than her fragile condition could easily afford. Before he left the room, Charlotte spoke once more, her voice quieter now, tinged with something that sounded almost like sorrow rather than anger. She told him that she remembered clearly the day he had proposed to her, kneeling beside the river near her family's countryside home, promising her a life built on partnership and honesty rather than title and comfort. She said she still believed that man existed somewhere beneath the version of him she had come to know over the past year, and that she hoped, eventually, he would find his way back to being that person again, even if she was no longer the one standing beside him when he did. Edward left the clinic that night feeling more hollow than he had in his entire adult life, the folder of evidence tucked beneath his arm like a physical weight he could not set down. He drove home slowly, unwilling to rush past the events of the evening, replaying Charlotte's words over and over, searching for some hidden opening he might have missed, though deep down he suspected there was none left to find. When he arrived at the estate, he found Vivian waiting for him in the drawing room, having let herself in using a spare key he had given her weeks earlier during a moment of reckless affection he now deeply regretted. She stood as he entered, her expression a careful blend of concern and calculation, and asked immediately how Charlotte was doing, though her tone suggested more curiosity about what this meant for her own position than genuine worry for a woman she had never truly considered a rival worth respecting. Edward set the folder down on the table between them and told Vivian plainly that their relationship needed to end, not out of sudden loyalty to a marriage that was already legally over, but because he could no longer justify to himself the damage it had caused to people who deserved far better than the carelessness he had shown them both. Vivian's expression shifted quickly from concern to indignation, and she reminded him sharply that he had pursued her just as eagerly as she had ever pursued him, that she had not forced her way into his life uninvited. Edward did not argue the point, acknowledging quietly that she was right, that the failure belonged entirely to him and not to her, but he remained firm in his decision nonetheless. Vivian studied him for a long moment, clearly searching for some remaining leverage, some emotional thread she might pull to change his mind. But finding none, she gathered her coat and left without another word, the sound of the front door closing behind her feeling, to Edward, like the final page closing on a chapter of his life he now recognized as shallow and destructive from the very beginning. Alone in the drawing room, Edward opened Charlotte's folder once more, studying the evidence not with shame this time, but with a strange, clarifying resolve. If Charlotte had spent months quietly preparing to protect herself and their child, he decided he would spend whatever time remained before the birth preparing to become someone genuinely worth her eventual forgiveness, whether or not that forgiveness ever came. He picked up his phone and called Grant Coleman directly, informing the lawyer that he would not be contesting any aspect of the divorce filing, and that he wished instead to discuss how he might voluntarily strengthen the protections already established for his unborn child. Coleman, clearly surprised by the call, informed Edward that Charlotte had specifically instructed him not to accept any communication that appeared designed to manipulate the proceedings in Edward's favor. Edward assured him this was not his intention, and asked instead whether there was any way to demonstrate sincerity without violating Charlotte's wishes or adding further stress to her fragile condition. Coleman considered this for a long moment before suggesting a single, narrow path forward, one that would require Edward to prove his intentions not through words, but through consistent, verifiable action over an extended period of time, without any expectation of immediate reward or reconciliation. Edward agreed without hesitation, though as he ended the call, a new and unsettling thought crossed his mind. If Charlotte's condition worsened, if complications forced an early delivery, there would be legal and medical decisions to make in the coming days that could not wait for slow, careful trust-building. He would need to prove himself faster than he had originally believed, under circumstances far more urgent than he had anticipated when he first agreed to this uncertain path toward redemption. The first headline appeared only 2 days later, and it hit Edward with the force of a physical blow. A gossip column, one that thrived on scandal within the city's wealthiest families, ran a story detailing the collapse of the Whitmore marriage, including specific claims about a mistress, a pregnant wife, and a hastily filed divorce. Edward read the article standing in his kitchen, his coffee growing cold beside him, and felt a fresh wave of dread settle over him as he realized how quickly his private failures had become public entertainment for strangers who had never met him or Charlotte. He suspected immediately where the leak had come from, and a short investigation by his own staff confirmed it. Vivian, apparently unwilling to fade quietly from the narrative after their conversation in the drawing room, had spoken to a journalist under conditions of anonymity, providing enough specific details to make her involvement unmistakable to anyone who knew the situation closely. Edward felt a surge of anger at the betrayal, though he caught himself quickly, recognizing the hypocrisy of feeling wronged by someone he had personally wronged in far greater ways over many months. Margaret arrived at the estate within the hour, her face tight with the particular strain of a woman who had spent decades protecting her family's reputation, and now watched it crumble in a single news cycle. She informed Edward that calls had already begun coming in from concerned relatives, business partners, and members of the social circles the Whitmore family had cultivated for generations. She told him plainly that image alone would not save him this time, that the story had enough concrete detail to survive any attempt at denial, and that the only sensible path forward was complete, careful honesty rather than the evasive tactics he had relied on throughout his adult life. Edward asked his mother what she believed he should say publicly, if anything at all. Margaret considered the question carefully before answering that silence, in situations like this, often did more damage than a brief, honest statement acknowledging fault without excessive detail. She suggested he issue a short public statement taking full responsibility for the breakdown of his marriage, expressing concern for Charlotte's well-being and that of their unborn child, and requesting privacy for all parties involved during such a difficult time. She warned him against anything that sounded like an attempt to defend himself or minimize his behavior, reminding him that the public, much like Charlotte herself, had little patience left for excuses. He followed her advice, drafting a brief statement with careful attention to every word, avoiding any language that might sound self-serving or manipulative. Before releasing it, he contacted Grant Coleman to ensure the statement would not interfere with the ongoing legal proceedings or cause additional stress for Charlotte during her recovery. Coleman reviewed the statement and, somewhat to Edward's surprise, offered no objections, noting only that Charlotte would need to be informed before it was released publicly, out of basic courtesy given how directly it referenced her. Coleman relayed the statement to Charlotte later that day, and returned with her response through a brief, professional message rather than any personal communication. She had no objection to the statement being released, though she asked, through her lawyer, that Edward refrain from any further contact with journalists or public commentary beyond this single, carefully worded acknowledgement. Edward agreed immediately, relieved that she had not rejected the gesture outright, though he understood clearly that her cooperation here reflected practical necessity rather than any softening of her position toward him personally. Meanwhile, the pressure from the business side of the Whitmore estate began to mount as well. Several of the family's longtime business partners expressed concern over the public scandal, worried about how it might affect ongoing negotiations and investment agreements tied to the Whitmore name. Edward found himself spending long hours in meetings, reassuring nervous partners that the personal matters unfolding in his life would not interfere with the professional obligations of the estate, even as he privately wondered whether he still had the credibility to make such promises convincingly. During one particularly tense meeting with a longtime business associate named Nathan, a man who had known Edward since childhood and had always been remarkably blunt in his assessments, Edward found himself confronted with an unexpected question. Nathan asked him directly whether he actually intended to change, or whether this sudden display of responsibility was simply a temporary performance meant to weather the current storm before quietly returning to old habits once the scandal faded from public memory. Edward did not answer immediately, taking the question far more seriously than Nathan likely expected, and eventually admitted that he did not yet know the answer himself, only that he intended to try, regardless of whether anyone believed him capable of succeeding. Nathan's response surprised him. Rather than offering reassurance or skepticism, he simply told Edward that intentions meant very little without consistent proof over time, and that if Edward truly wanted to rebuild any part of his shattered reputation, both personally and professionally, he would need to accept that trust, once broken this thoroughly, could not be restored through grand gestures or emotional speeches. It would only return, if it ever did, through countless small, unremarkable actions repeated faithfully over a long period of time, with no guarantee of reward at the end of that effort. The words settled uncomfortably in Edward's mind over the following days, echoing his mother's earlier warning and reinforcing a truth he was only beginning to fully accept. He began making small changes, quiet and largely unnoticed by anyone outside his immediate household. He stopped attending the social gatherings where he had once spent countless evenings avoiding his responsibilities at home. He redirected significant time and energy into reviewing the estate's finances personally, rather than delegating the task entirely to advisors as he had done for years. He even began attending sessions with a counselor recommended by Grant Coleman, someone experienced in helping individuals navigate the aftermath of infidelity and family breakdown. Though he attended these sessions privately, without publicizing them in any way that might appear performative. Despite these efforts, communication with Charlotte remained limited to strictly necessary legal and medical matters, conveyed almost entirely through Coleman or through brief, formal messages relayed by Henry when medical updates were required. Edward learned, through these limited channels, that Charlotte's blood pressure had stabilized somewhat under careful medical supervision, though the doctors remained cautious, monitoring her condition closely and warning that any significant stress could still trigger a relapse of her earlier symptoms. He found himself desperate for any small piece of information about how she was truly doing, beyond the clinical updates provided through official channels. During one exchange with Henry, arranged solely to confirm a medical appointment schedule, Edward finally asked, carefully and without pressure, whether Charlotte was doing well emotionally, beyond her physical condition. Henry hesitated for a long moment before answering, his tone noticeably less hostile than it had been during their earlier encounters at the clinic. Henry admitted that Charlotte had good days and difficult days, much like anyone navigating both a high-risk pregnancy and the end of a significant relationship simultaneously. He mentioned, somewhat reluctantly, that she had seen the public statement Edward released, and that while she had not commented extensively on it, she had seemed, in Henry's observation, quietly relieved that Edward had chosen honesty over denial or self-justification. It was a small piece of information, offered almost as an afterthought, but it meant more to Edward than any grand gesture could have at that point in the unfolding situation. As the days passed, Vivian's presence in the media coverage gradually diminished, replaced by growing public interest in Charlotte's calm, dignified handling of the entire ordeal, particularly once details emerged, likely through Coleman's careful management of public perception, regarding the protective legal measures Charlotte had established for her unborn child well before the scandal broke publicly. Public sentiment, once uncertain about where sympathy should fall, began shifting decisively in Charlotte's favor, portraying her not as a victim, but as a woman of remarkable foresight and composure under extraordinarily difficult circumstances. Edward read these evolving public narratives with a strange mixture of pride and renewed shame, recognizing in Charlotte's growing public respect the very qualities he had failed to fully appreciate while they were still married. He realized, with painful clarity, that the woman being praised now in newspapers and social circles for her strength and intelligence was the same woman he had once dismissed as simply gentle and accommodating, never recognizing the depth of resolve and self-respect she had carried quietly beneath that gentleness the entire time. One evening, nearly 2 weeks after the initial confrontation at Vivian's residence, Edward received an unexpected message directly from Charlotte herself, the first personal communication she had sent him since their brief conversation at the clinic. The message was brief and carefully worded, informing him that her doctors had scheduled an important appointment the following week to assess whether her pregnancy could safely continue to full term, or whether an earlier delivery might become medically necessary for her safety and the child's well-being. She informed him of the appointment not out of any desire to reconcile, but because she believed he had a right to be present for significant developments regarding their child's health, provided he continued to respect the boundaries she had established regarding their personal relationship. Edward read the message several times, recognizing in its careful, measured tone the same quality he had witnessed throughout every interaction with her since the divorce papers first arrived. A woman determined to protect her child's interests without allowing personal emotion to compromise her judgment. He replied simply, thanking her for informing him and confirming that he would attend the appointment, making no attempt to add anything further that might overstep the careful boundaries she had drawn. As he set down his phone that evening, he found himself hoping, more fervently than he had allowed himself to hope in weeks, that whatever the doctors discovered during that appointment would bring good news for both mother and child, regardless of what it might mean for his own uncertain path back toward earning any measure of Charlotte's trust again. The waiting room outside Dr. Whitfield's office felt smaller than Edward remembered from his previous visits to the clinic, though he suspected the room had not changed at all. Only his own nerves had grown sharper with each passing day since Charlotte's message arrived. He arrived early, deliberately, wanting to avoid any appearance of carelessness, and sat quietly in a corner chair, watching the door for any sign of her arrival. Charlotte appeared nearly 20 minutes later, accompanied by Henry, who nodded curtly at Edward without offering any further greeting. She looked tired, her face slightly swollen in the way pregnancy sometimes caused this late in its progression, but her eyes were alert and steady as she took a seat across the room rather than beside him, maintaining the careful physical distance she had established since their conversation at the clinic weeks earlier. Edward respected the boundary without comment, though something in him ached quietly at the sight of her sitting so deliberately far away. Dr. Whitfield called them in together only a few minutes later, explaining that today's appointment would involve a detailed assessment of both Charlotte's blood pressure management and the baby's overall growth and positioning. She reviewed the recent test results with visible concern, noting that while Charlotte's condition had stabilized somewhat over the past 2 weeks, certain markers suggested the risk of complications remained elevated enough to warrant serious discussion about the safest path forward for the remainder of the pregnancy. The doctor explained, carefully and without alarming language, that there were essentially 2 options available. The first involved continuing the pregnancy under intensive monitoring, hoping to reach a safer gestational age before delivery, accepting the ongoing risk that Charlotte's condition might worsen suddenly and require emergency intervention. The second option involved scheduling an earlier, controlled delivery within the coming days, accepting the risks associated with a slightly premature birth in exchange for removing the ongoing strain that the pregnancy was placing on Charlotte's body. Charlotte listened to this information with the same composed attentiveness Edward had come to recognize as characteristic of her, asking precise, practical questions about the specific risks associated with each option, both for herself and for the child. Edward remained mostly silent throughout this exchange, understanding that this decision belonged primarily to Charlotte and her medical team, though he found himself desperately hoping she would ask for his input, a small sign that his presence in this process still carried some meaning beyond mere formality. Eventually, Dr. Whitfield turned to Edward and asked whether he had any questions or concerns of his own, acknowledging his role as the child's father even amid the complicated circumstances surrounding the pregnancy. Edward asked, carefully, whether an earlier delivery carried significantly higher risk to the child's health compared to waiting, wanting to understand the situation fully rather than simply reacting emotionally to unfamiliar medical terminology. Dr. Whitfield answered honestly, explaining that while earlier deliveries always carried some additional risk, modern medical care had significantly improved outcomes for babies born even several weeks early, and that in Charlotte's specific case, the risks of waiting appeared to outweigh the modest additional risks associated with delivering slightly ahead of schedule. After further discussion, Charlotte made her decision, choosing to proceed with a scheduled early delivery within the next several days, prioritizing her own stability and the reduction of ongoing risk over the uncertain benefits of waiting longer. Dr. Whitfield nodded approvingly, noting that this was often the wiser choice in situations involving persistent blood pressure concerns, and began outlining the practical steps required to prepare for the procedure. As the appointment concluded, Charlotte turned to Edward directly for the first time since arriving, her expression unreadable but her voice steady. She informed him that she intended for him to be present during the delivery, not as a gesture of reconciliation, but because she believed their child deserved to have both parents present for such a significant moment, regardless of the personal complications between them. Edward felt a wave of gratitude wash over him so intensely that he had to pause before responding, thanking her quietly and promising he would be there, exactly as she requested, with no expectations beyond that single, important responsibility. The days leading up to the scheduled delivery passed slowly for Edward, filled with a strange combination of anxious waiting and quiet, deliberate preparation. He spoke with Grant Coleman about ensuring that all necessary legal and financial arrangements were properly in place, wanting to demonstrate through action, rather than words, that he supported the protections Charlotte had established for their child, without hesitation or resentment. He also continued his private counseling sessions, using the anxious waiting period to examine honestly the patterns of avoidance and selfishness that had led him to this point in the first place. On the morning of the scheduled delivery, Edward arrived at the clinic before dawn, unable to sleep through the final hours of waiting. He found Henry already present in the family waiting area, along with Margaret, who had insisted on being there despite Charlotte's initial reluctance to involve her former mother-in-law so directly in such a personal moment. Margaret explained quietly to Edward that Charlotte had eventually agreed to her presence, recognizing that regardless of the divorce, Margaret's support during childbirth came from genuine affection rather than any attempt to interfere in the couple's personal matters. The hours that followed felt both impossibly long and disorienting in their intensity. Edward was permitted into the delivery room itself, standing near Charlotte's side as the medical team worked with calm efficiency, though he remained careful not to overstep the physical or emotional boundaries she had established throughout their recent interactions. Charlotte gripped the edge of the hospital bed tightly during moments of intense discomfort, her breathing controlled through methods she had clearly practiced in preparation for this moment. And though she did not reach for Edward's hand, she did not ask him to step back either, a small but meaningful signal that he chose to interpret with cautious hope rather than overreaching expectation. Partway through the procedure, the calm efficiency of the room shifted abruptly into something more urgent. Dr. Whitfield's voice sharpened noticeably as she communicated rapid instructions to the surrounding medical staff, and Edward felt his chest tighten with fear as he watched monitors beside Charlotte's bed display readings. He did not fully understand, but recognized instinctively as concerning. A nurse informed him quickly, though without excessive alarm, that the baby's heart rate had dropped briefly during the final stages of delivery, and that the medical team needed to move quickly to ensure a safe delivery for both mother and child. The next several minutes felt to Edward like the longest of his entire life, a blur of urgent movement, quiet but forceful medical instructions, and Charlotte's controlled, determined effort despite her obvious exhaustion and fear. He stood frozen near her side, unable to offer any meaningful assistance beyond simply remaining present, silently praying, in a way he had not genuinely prayed since childhood, that both Charlotte and their child would emerge from this moment safely. Then finally, a small, sharp cry filled the room, cutting through the tension like a sudden burst of light after a long stretch of darkness. Dr. Whitfield's posture relaxed almost immediately, and she announced with clear relief evident in her voice that the baby, a healthy daughter despite her early arrival, appeared strong and stable, her earlier distress resolved quickly once she had been fully delivered. The medical team continued their careful checks, but the immediate danger had passed, replaced by the practical, methodical work of ensuring both mother and newborn transitioned safely through the final stages of recovery. Edward felt tears streaming freely down his face, unable and unwilling to stop them, as he watched the nurses gently clean and wrap his daughter before placing her carefully against Charlotte's chest. Charlotte, exhausted but radiant with relief, looked down at their daughter with an expression of pure, uncomplicated love, momentarily setting aside every complicated emotion that existed between herself and Edward, in favor of this single, overwhelming moment of connection with the child she had protected so fiercely throughout the preceding months. After a few quiet minutes, Charlotte looked up at Edward, her exhaustion evident but her eyes clear and steady. She asked him softly if he would like to hold his daughter. Edward nodded, unable to trust his voice fully, and carefully took the small, impossibly light bundle into his arms for the first time. He looked down at his daughter's tiny face, taking in every small detail with an intensity he had never experienced before, and felt something fundamental shift within him, a clarity of purpose that no amount of scandal, business pressure, or personal ambition had ever managed to provide him previously. Charlotte watched this moment quietly, her expression difficult to interpret fully, though Edward thought he detected something softer in her gaze than the careful composure she had maintained throughout their recent interactions. She did not say anything about reconciliation, did not offer any indication that this shared moment of joy changed the fundamental trajectory of their separation. But she also did not rush to reclaim the physical distance she had maintained so carefully in previous weeks, allowing this one moment to exist simply as what it was, a shared celebration of new life untouched, for these few precious minutes, by the complicated history between them. Later that day, once Charlotte had rested, and the immediate medical concerns had settled into routine post-delivery monitoring, Edward found himself alone briefly with his daughter while Charlotte slept, and the rest of the family stepped out to gather food and update relatives waiting anxiously for news. He sat quietly beside the small hospital bassinet, watching his daughter sleep, and made a private, silent promise to himself that regardless of what happened between himself and Charlotte moving forward, he would spend the rest of his life proving himself worthy of being called this child's father, not through wealth or title, but through the same patient, consistent honesty that Charlotte had demonstrated so powerfully throughout this entire, difficult ordeal. When Charlotte woke later that evening, she found Edward still seated quietly beside their daughter, gently humming a soft, wordless tune Charlotte recognized from early in their courtship. A small habit he had once used to calm his own nerves during stressful moments long before either of them had imagined the complicated path that would eventually lead them here. She watched him for a long moment without announcing that she had woken, studying this quiet, unguarded version of him with an expression that mixed lingering hurt with something else entirely, something she was not yet ready to name even to herself. 3 weeks after their daughter's birth, a name finally settled between them almost by accident. Charlotte had been experimenting with different possibilities aloud during a quiet afternoon, while Edward sat nearby reviewing paperwork from Coleman's office. And when she tried the name Rosalind, testing how it sounded spoken directly to the baby resting in her arms, something in the room seemed to settle naturally into place. Edward looked up and admitted quietly that it suited her perfectly, and Charlotte, somewhat to her own surprise, found herself agreeing without hesitation, the decision arriving with none of the tension that had characterized so many of their other interactions since the divorce began. Life settled into an uneasy but functional rhythm over the following weeks. Charlotte remained at the small rented apartment on the edge of the city, now equipped with additional support arranged discreetly by Henry and Margaret, while Edward visited regularly, always by prior arrangement, always respectful of the boundaries. Charlotte continued to enforce carefully around their interactions. He learned to change diapers under the patient, slightly amused instruction of a hired nurse who had clearly seen many nervous new fathers struggle through the same unfamiliar task. He learned to recognize the specific cries that indicated hunger versus discomfort versus simple restlessness, small pieces of knowledge that felt disproportionately significant to a man who had spent most of his adult life avoiding responsibilities of any real weight. The divorce proceedings themselves moved forward steadily during this period, guided by Coleman's careful management and Edward's continued refusal to contest any of the protective measures Charlotte had established for Rosalind's future. Coleman remarked during one meeting that he had rarely, in his extensive career, encountered a case where the party being divorced cooperated so thoroughly and without resistance, a comment that Edward received with quiet acceptance rather than any lingering resentment about the terms being imposed upon him. It was during this fragile period of gradual, cautious progress that Vivian reappeared, arriving unannounced at the estate on a gray afternoon nearly 2 months after their final conversation in the drawing room. Edward was reviewing estate accounts when Alfred informed him of her presence, and he felt an immediate tightening in his chest, uncertain what her return could possibly mean after the clear finality of their last exchange. Vivian entered the study with none of her previous warmth, her expression tense and guarded in a way Edward had rarely seen from her before. She informed him, without preamble, that she believed herself to be pregnant, and that based on her own careful accounting of dates, the timing aligned closely with the period during which she and Edward had still been involved, before his final decision to end their relationship following Charlotte's departure from the estate. Edward felt the floor seem to shift beneath him, the careful progress of recent weeks suddenly threatened by an entirely new complication he had never anticipated. He asked Vivian, as calmly as he could manage, whether she had confirmed this through proper medical testing, and she admitted that she had taken only a preliminary home test, though she intended to seek full confirmation soon. Edward sat in stunned silence for a long moment, his mind racing through the implications this revelation could carry, not only for his own uncertain path toward reconciliation with Charlotte, but for an entirely new child who might soon exist within this already complicated web of relationships. He asked Vivian directly what she intended to do, and what she hoped from him should the pregnancy be confirmed. Her answer surprised him with its bluntness. She stated plainly that she did not expect or particularly want any renewed romantic relationship between them, having watched closely enough over recent months to understand that whatever remained of Edward's genuine affection belonged entirely to Charlotte and Rosalind, regardless of how the divorce ultimately concluded. What she wanted instead was clarity regarding financial support and involvement, should the child indeed prove to be his, delivered honestly and without the evasive patterns that had characterized so much of their previous relationship. Edward respected this directness, recognizing in it perhaps the first genuinely honest exchange he had ever shared with Vivian throughout their entire acquaintance. He told her that regardless of what a confirmed test eventually revealed, he intended to handle the situation with full transparency, including informing Charlotte immediately rather than allowing her to learn of it through rumor or accidental discovery, as she had with their entire prior relationship. Vivian seemed somewhat taken aback by this response, having perhaps expected resistance or attempts at concealment given his history, but she nodded slowly, accepting his commitment with cautious, uncertain trust. That evening, Edward faced perhaps the most difficult decision of the entire ordeal, weighing whether to inform Charlotte immediately about a situation that remained unconfirmed, potentially causing her significant additional stress during a period when her health and emotional stability still required careful protection, or whether to wait for full medical confirmation before risking such a disruptive conversation. Ultimately, remembering the lesson Charlotte's own careful, evidence-based approach had taught him so painfully, he decided that partial honesty delivered too late was no better than the deceptions he was trying to move beyond, and resolved to inform her promptly, while being clear about the uncertainty still surrounding the situation. He requested a brief meeting with Charlotte the following day, specifying that the matter was serious but did not concern Rosalind's health or safety, hoping to prevent unnecessary panic before he had the chance to explain fully. Charlotte agreed to meet him at a quiet cafe near her apartment, a small gesture of trust that Edward recognized as significant given how carefully she had structured their interactions in recent weeks to avoid any appearance of renewed intimacy. He explained the situation to her plainly, without minimizing the seriousness of what Vivian had told him, and without attempting to soften his own responsibility for having created a circumstance where such a complication remained possible in the first place. Charlotte listened with the same composed attention she brought to every difficult conversation, though Edward noticed her hands tighten slightly around her coffee cup as he spoke, the only outward sign of the emotional weight this news carried for her personally, even amid an already finalized divorce. When he finished, Charlotte remained quiet for a long moment before responding. She told him with careful precision that while this news was undeniably painful to hear, it did not fundamentally change anything about the decisions she had already made regarding their marriage, since those decisions had been based on the pattern of dishonesty and carelessness he had displayed, a pattern this new complication only further confirmed rather than newly revealed. What mattered now, she said, was how he chose to handle the situation moving forward, particularly regarding any child that might result from it, and how that handling might affect Rosalind's future understanding of her own family circumstances as she grew older. Edward assured her that regardless of the outcome, he intended to take full responsibility, financially and personally, for any child confirmed to be his, and that he would ensure Rosalind was never placed in a position of confusion or exclusion regarding any half-sibling that might eventually enter her life. Charlotte nodded slowly, accepting this commitment with the same cautious, measured trust she had extended toward every other promise he had made since the divorce began, neither dismissing it outright nor allowing herself to fully believe it until it was proven true through sustained action. The following week brought the medical confirmation both Edward and Vivian had been anxiously awaiting, delivered through a brief, formal message from Vivian informing him that the pregnancy test had come back negative upon proper clinical testing. The earlier positive result apparently a false reading caused by a combination of stress and an improperly used home testing kit. Edward felt an overwhelming wave of relief wash over him upon reading the message, though it was quickly followed by a more complicated, sobering realization about how close this entire situation had come to creating an even more tangled web of consequences, stemming directly from his earlier carelessness. He informed Charlotte of the updated news promptly, as he had promised, and though she expressed no particular emotional reaction beyond a brief acknowledgement of relief for everyone involved, Edward sensed a subtle shift in the atmosphere between them during their following interactions, a slightly greater willingness on her part to engage with him beyond the strictly necessary logistics of co-parenting Rosalind. It was not forgiveness, not yet, and Edward understood clearly that it might never fully arrive regardless of how much he continued to change and grow through this difficult period. But it felt, for the first time since the entire scandal began, like the faint, uncertain beginning of something that might eventually resemble genuine mutual respect, built slowly and carefully from the wreckage of everything that had come before. 6 months passed, marked by the quiet, unglamorous rhythm of Rosalind's early infancy, and the slow, uneven progress of two people learning how to coexist as parents without the framework of marriage to guide their interactions. Edward continued his weekly counseling sessions, now venturing occasionally into joint sessions, with Charlotte specifically focused on co-parenting communication, something Coleman had gently suggested might benefit both of them regardless of whether their personal relationship ever moved beyond its current, carefully bounded arrangement. During this period, Edward also began restructuring significant portions of his professional life, stepping back from several social and business commitments that had previously consumed enormous amounts of his time without providing any meaningful sense of purpose. He redirected much of that energy toward a charitable initiative connected to the estate, focused on supporting local maternal health services, a project inspired directly by the frightening complications Charlotte had experienced during her pregnancy and delivery. He never publicized the personal motivation behind this work, preferring instead to let the effort speak quietly for itself, rather than using it as another performance meant to rehabilitate his public image. Charlotte, meanwhile, had begun cautiously rebuilding her own independent life, securing a modest but comfortable permanent residence separate from the Whitmore estate, funded partly through the financial settlement established during the divorce, and partly through work she had begun taking on as a consultant for a charitable foundation, drawing on skills and connections she had quietly developed during years when Edward had barely noticed her interests extending beyond their household and social obligations. Edward found himself genuinely impressed observing this growth, recognizing with some discomfort how thoroughly he had underestimated her capabilities and ambitions throughout their marriage, assuming incorrectly that her quiet nature reflected a lack of independent drive rather than simply a patient, private determination. During one of the scheduled visits arranged for Edward's time with Rosalind, he arrived to find Charlotte in the company of a man he did not recognize, introduced simply as Nathaniel, a colleague from her work with the charitable foundation. The introduction was brief and entirely professional in tone, but Edward could not entirely suppress the sharp, uncomfortable twist of jealousy that accompanied the sight of another man standing comfortably in Charlotte's home, engaged in easy, familiar conversation with her, in a way that reminded him painfully of the comfortable intimacy they themselves had once shared. He said nothing about it that day, reminding himself firmly that he had no claim whatsoever to any romantic authority over Charlotte's personal life, having forfeited that claim entirely through his own actions many months earlier. But the encounter lingered uncomfortably in his mind over the following days, forcing him to confront honestly whether his continued efforts toward growth and redemption were genuinely motivated by a desire to become a better person and father, or whether they remained secretly tangled with a lingering hope of eventually winning Charlotte back romantically, a hope he had never fully examined or acknowledged even to himself. He raised this internal conflict during his next counseling session, admitting for the first time the uncomfortable possibility that his transformation, however genuine in its daily actions, might still be rooted partly in a desire for reconciliation rather than pure, unconditional growth. His counselor responded thoughtfully, suggesting that both motivations could coexist honestly within him, and that the true test of his character would not be whether he hoped for reconciliation, a natural and understandable hope given everything that had happened between them, but whether he could continue behaving with the same consistent integrity regardless of whether that reconciliation ever actually occurred. This distinction settled into Edward's mind with unusual clarity, and he found himself, over the following weeks, deliberately examining his own actions through this new lens. He continued his scheduled visits with Rosalind without any attempt to extend those visits into additional time with Charlotte beyond what was strictly necessary. He supported her growing friendship, and eventually clearly developing romantic interest, in Nathaniel, without allowing jealousy to influence his tone or behavior during their necessary co-parenting interactions. It was, he found, one of the most difficult disciplines he had ever attempted to maintain, requiring a level of genuine selflessness he had rarely demonstrated at any previous point in his life. The formal divorce was finalized during this period, concluding with minimal drama given how thoroughly Edward had cooperated with every term Charlotte and her legal team had established. The final signing took place in Coleman's office, a brief, almost anticlimactic meeting, given the enormous emotional weight the entire process had carried over the preceding months. Charlotte signed her portion of the documents with steady, practiced composure, while Edward found himself surprised by the quiet, unexpected grief that accompanied the finality of the moment, even though he understood clearly and without resentment that this outcome had been the only reasonable conclusion to everything his own actions had set into motion. After the signing concluded, Charlotte lingered briefly in the office rather than leaving immediately, a small deviation from her usual efficient departures that caught Edward's attention. She told him, somewhat unexpectedly, that she wanted him to know she had noticed the changes in his behavior over the preceding months, not simply through Rosalind's care, but through the broader pattern of his conduct across every aspect of his life that she had occasion to observe or hear about through mutual acquaintances. She was careful to clarify that this acknowledgement did not signal any romantic reconsideration on her part, particularly given her growing relationship with Nathaniel, but she wanted him to understand that his efforts had not gone entirely unnoticed or unappreciated, even if they had arrived too late to save their marriage. Edward thanked her sincerely, resisting the strong urge to ask directly about her relationship with Nathaniel or to press for any reconsideration of the finality she had just reaffirmed. Instead, he simply asked whether she was happy, a question he realized, with some discomfort, he had rarely if ever asked her sincerely throughout the entirety of their marriage. Charlotte considered the question seriously before answering that she was, for the first time in a long while, building a life that felt entirely her own, shaped by her own choices and priorities, rather than by expectations imposed upon her through marriage or social position. Her answer, though it confirmed the permanent end of any romantic future between them, brought Edward an unexpected sense of peace rather than renewed grief. He recognized, sitting in that quiet office with the finalized divorce papers spread across the table between them, that genuine love, the kind he had failed so completely to demonstrate during their marriage, sometimes meant releasing someone fully into a happiness that did not include you, rather than continuing to hope for a version of the future built primarily around your own desires and regrets. In the weeks that followed the finalization, Edward's relationship with Rosalind continued to deepen steadily, unaffected by the legal conclusion of his marriage to her mother. He established a comfortable, predictable routine of visits, learning to navigate the practical realities of co-parenting with growing confidence and far less anxiety than he had experienced during the earlier, more uncertain months following her birth. Charlotte, for her part, continued to extend cautious but genuine cooperation, gradually allowing small additional flexibilities into their arrangement, as Edward consistently demonstrated reliability and respect for the boundaries she maintained. It was during a particularly ordinary afternoon visit, watching Rosalind take her first unsteady, giggling steps across the living room floor of Charlotte's home, that Edward finally understood, with complete and settled clarity, the true shape of the life he had ultimately built from the wreckage of his own earlier failures. It was not the life he had once imagined for himself, filled with effortless comfort and unchallenged privilege, nor was it the life he had briefly hoped to reclaim during the earliest, most desperate days following Charlotte's departure. It was instead a smaller, quieter, far more honest life, built entirely on the patient, unglamorous work of showing up consistently for the people who depended on him, regardless of whether that consistency ever earned him the romantic reconciliation he had once secretly hoped for. Charlotte, watching from across the room as Rosalind stumbled happily into Edward's outstretched arms, felt her own complicated mixture of emotions settle, for the first time in many months, into something resembling genuine peace. She had not forgiven him entirely, and perhaps never fully would for the specific pain his choices had caused her during one of the most vulnerable periods of her life. But she recognized, watching him now, a father fully present and genuinely engaged with their daughter, that whatever failures had characterized their marriage, something valuable and worth protecting had nonetheless emerged from its difficult, painful ending. 2 years passed, marked by the steady, undramatic accumulation of small milestones that mattered far more to Edward than any of the grand social occasions that had once defined his sense of importance. Rosalind grew from an unsteady toddler into a curious, talkative young girl, splitting her time comfortably between her mother's home and the estate, where Edward had transformed an entire wing of the house into a bright, welcoming space designed specifically with her needs and interests in mind, rather than the formal, adult-focused atmosphere that had once dominated every room of the Whitmore residence. Charlotte's relationship with Nathaniel had deepened steadily during this period, culminating in a quiet, modest wedding attended by close friends and family, rather than the elaborate social spectacle that had characterized her first marriage to Edward. Edward attended the ceremony at Charlotte's specific invitation, extended not out of any lingering romantic complication, but out of a genuine desire for Rosalind to see her parents maintaining a respectful, cooperative relationship, even as her mother began an entirely new chapter of happiness. He stood near the back of the small gathering, watching Charlotte exchange vows with a man who clearly adored her, and felt, to his own quiet surprise, nothing but genuine happiness for her. Untangled at last from any residual hope of reconciliation he had once secretly carried. Nathaniel proved, over time, to be a thoughtful and consistent presence in Rosalind's life as well, and Edward found himself grateful rather than threatened by this development, recognizing that his daughter's life had become richer through the addition of another adult genuinely invested in her well-being, rather than diminished through any perceived competition for her affection. The two men developed a cautious but functional respect for one another, cooperating smoothly on the practical logistics of raising Rosalind between two households, prioritizing her stability and happiness above any lingering awkwardness that might have existed between them given the complicated history connecting all three adults. Edward's charitable initiative focused on maternal health services expanded significantly during these 2 years, eventually growing into one of the most respected programs of its kind within the region, credited with meaningfully improving outcomes for expectant mothers facing complications similar to those Charlotte had experienced during her pregnancy with Rosalind. Edward remained deeply involved in the program's daily operations, finding in this work a sense of purpose and satisfaction that had eluded him throughout the earlier, more self-indulgent years of his adult life. He rarely spoke publicly about the personal history that had inspired the initiative, preferring to let the program's tangible results speak for themselves rather than using his own past mistakes as a marketing narrative for personal redemption. His relationship with Vivian, following the resolution of the pregnancy scare, settled into a distant but civil acquaintance. Occasionally crossing paths at social events, neither could entirely avoid given their overlapping circles, though any warmth that had once existed between them had long since faded into a mutual, unspoken understanding that their brief involvement had caused far more damage than either of them had fully anticipated at the time. Vivian eventually moved away from the city entirely, pursuing new opportunities elsewhere, and Edward found that her departure brought him a quiet sense of closure regarding that particular chapter of his life, allowing him to fully release any lingering guilt or complicated emotion associated with their relationship. Margaret, Edward's mother, remained a steady presence throughout Rosalind's early childhood, delighting in her role as a doting grandmother in a way that softened considerably the formal, somewhat distant parenting style she had employed during Edward's own childhood. She often remarked, during quiet conversations with Edward, how proud she was of the transformation she had witnessed in her son over these past several years, though she was always careful to remind him that this pride stemmed from his sustained, consistent actions rather than any single dramatic gesture, echoing the same lesson she had first offered him during the darkest early days of the scandal. Henry, too, gradually softened his initial hostility toward Edward, though the two men never developed anything resembling genuine closeness, their relationship instead settling into a respectful, practical cooperation centered entirely around their shared investment in Rosalind's well-being. Henry admitted once, during a rare, candid conversation, that he had genuinely expected Edward's apparent transformation to fade once the immediate pressure of the scandal subsided, and that he had been quietly, if reluctantly, impressed by the sustained consistency Edward had demonstrated instead, a rare and unexpected concession from a man who had never hidden his skepticism throughout the entire ordeal. As Rosalind approached her 3rd birthday, Charlotte and Edward found themselves collaborating closely on planning a small celebration, a task that required considerably more direct communication and coordination than their usual carefully bounded interactions typically demanded. During one of these planning conversations, held over coffee at a quiet cafe similar to the one where Edward had first informed her of the pregnancy scare with Vivian years earlier, Charlotte paused unexpectedly and told him something she had apparently been considering for some time. She told him that she had recently reflected on the entire experience they had shared, from the painful discovery of his infidelity through the difficult months of legal separation and medical uncertainty, surrounding Rosalind's birth, and had come to recognize that, while she would never regret the decision to end their marriage, she had also come to genuinely appreciate the person he had become in its aftermath. She clarified immediately that this appreciation did not represent any reconsideration of their romantic relationship, which she considered permanently and appropriately concluded, but rather a recognition of him as a co-parent, and increasingly, as someone she could genuinely trust and respect in that specific, limited capacity. Edward received this acknowledgement with quiet gratitude, understanding clearly that it represented the highest form of validation he could reasonably hope to receive from her at this point in their complicated shared history. He told her honestly that regardless of whatever else had been lost through his own earlier failures, he considered the ongoing opportunity to be Rosalind's father, and to maintain even this limited, carefully bounded relationship with Charlotte herself, to be a privilege he no longer took for granted in any way. Rosalind's third birthday celebration took place on a warm afternoon in the gardens of the Whitmore estate, attended by both sides of her extended family in a display of cooperative, blended celebration that would have seemed unimaginable during the darkest days of the initial scandal years earlier. Charlotte and Nathaniel stood together comfortably near one end of the garden, while Edward, Margaret, and Henry occupied another area nearby, all of them united in their shared focus on the delighted young girl at the center of the celebration, oblivious to the complicated adult history that had shaped the unusual blended family surrounding her. At one point during the celebration, Rosalind ran unsteadily across the garden lawn toward Edward, arms outstretched, calling for him with the simple, uncomplicated joy unique to small children who have not yet learned to carry the weight of adult complications and regrets. Edward scooped her up easily, spinning her gently as she laughed, and felt, in that single unguarded moment, the full, complete weight of everything he had gained through the painful process of losing so much else. He caught Charlotte's eye briefly across the garden as he set Rosalind back down, and she offered him a small, genuine smile, not the warm, romantic affection they had once shared as husband and wife, but something perhaps more valuable in its own quiet way, the simple, hard-won respect of two people who had navigated an extraordinarily difficult situation, and emerged from it having built something worth protecting together, despite everything. As the celebration wound down and guests began departing, Edward found himself alone briefly in the garden, watching the last light of afternoon fade gently across the estate grounds where he had once stood trembling, years earlier, reading the divorce papers that had changed the entire trajectory of his life. He thought back to that terrified, humiliated version of himself, standing outside Vivian's house with shaking hands, utterly unprepared for the reckoning that letter had represented, and felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude for the painful, necessary transformation that moment had ultimately set into motion. He understood now, with a clarity that had taken years of difficult, unglamorous effort to achieve, that Charlotte's decision to leave had never truly been about revenge or punishment, despite how devastating it had initially felt to him. It had been, from the very beginning, an act of profound self-respect and protective love, both for herself and for the child she carried, delivered with a composure and precision that had ultimately forced him to confront and rebuild every fundamentally broken aspect of his own character. The trembling he had experienced reading those papers years earlier had been, he now recognized, not simply fear of losing everything he valued, but the necessary, painful beginning of finally becoming a person worth valuing in the first place. 7 more years slipped by, carrying Rosalind from a bright, chattering toddler into a thoughtful 10-year-old girl with her mother's steady gaze, and much to Edward's quiet amusement, his own stubborn curiosity about the world around her. She split her weeks comfortably between the estate and the home Charlotte shared with Nathaniel, and more recently, a younger half-brother named Oliver, born 2 years earlier and adored instantly by Rosalind, who had never once shown the jealousy some might have expected from an only child suddenly asked to share her mother's attention. It was a school assignment that finally brought the old story back into the open, something Rosalind had managed to avoid confronting directly for most of her young life despite growing up, surrounded by its quiet aftermath. Her class had been asked to prepare a short presentation about their family history, tracing back through at least 2 generations, and Rosalind arrived at the estate one afternoon with a notebook full of questions. Her expression, a mixture of determination and nervous curiosity, that immediately told Edward this conversation would require more care than any homework assignment typically demanded. She asked him plainly, sitting across from him in the same study where he had once received the news of her impending birth from a stranger's telephone call, why her parents had divorced before she was even born. She explained that she had overheard fragments of the story over the years, whispered comments from relatives who assumed she was too young to understand, vague references in old newspaper archives she had stumbled across during an idle afternoon of curious searching. And she wanted, finally, to hear the full truth directly from him, rather than continuing to piece it together from incomplete, second-hand fragments. Edward considered his answer carefully, remembering every lesson he had learned throughout the difficult years following the initial scandal about the value of honesty delivered with appropriate care, rather than excessive detail. He told her, gently but truthfully, that he had made serious mistakes early in his marriage to her mother, choices that had hurt Charlotte deeply, and had ultimately led to their decision to separate before Rosalind was even born. He did not attempt to minimize his responsibility, nor did he burden his 10-year-old daughter with details she was not yet prepared to fully process, striking a careful balance between honesty and appropriate protection that he hoped reflected the same wisdom Charlotte had always demonstrated throughout the ordeal. Rosalind listened with the same serious, attentive expression Edward recognized from Charlotte during difficult conversations, absorbing his words without immediate reaction, processing them with a thoughtfulness that seemed remarkable for a child her age. Eventually, she asked whether he had loved her mother during that difficult time, and whether he loved her mother still. Edward answered honestly that he had, in his own flawed and incomplete way, loved Charlotte deeply during their marriage, though he had failed to demonstrate that love through the consistent honesty and respect she deserved. As for the present, he explained carefully that the love he now felt for Charlotte existed in an entirely different form, rooted in deep respect and gratitude for her strength and wisdom, rather than any romantic feeling, since both of their lives had moved forward in healthy, separate directions that made both of them genuinely happy. Rosalind absorbed this answer thoughtfully before asking her final, most difficult question, one that Edward had privately anticipated for years, without ever fully preparing an adequate response. She asked whether he regretted the mistakes he had made, given that those same mistakes had ultimately led to the family structure that now included her mother's happy marriage to Nathaniel, her own close relationship with her younger brother Oliver, and Edward's own transformed sense of purpose through his charitable work. She wondered, with the blunt logical curiosity unique to children, whether regretting the original mistake meant regretting the entire chain of events that had followed from it, events that had ultimately created a life she genuinely loved. Edward considered this question with the seriousness it deserved, recognizing in it a depth of reflection he had not expected from a child her age, though he supposed growing up surrounded by the quiet aftermath of complicated adult choices had perhaps accelerated her capacity for this kind of nuanced thinking. He told her carefully that it was possible to deeply regret causing pain to someone you loved, while still feeling genuine gratitude for the person you eventually became as a result of confronting and repairing that harm. The mistake itself remained something he would always regret, he explained, because it had been unnecessary and had caused real suffering to her mother during an already difficult and vulnerable time. But the transformation that mistake had ultimately forced him to undergo, and the life that transformation had allowed him to build alongside her, Charlotte, Nathaniel, and Oliver, was something he could genuinely be grateful for, without those two feelings ever needing to cancel each other out. Rosalind seemed satisfied with this answer, jotting a few final notes into her notebook, before changing the subject entirely to ask whether he would help her build a small model of the estate for the visual portion of her presentation. The earlier heaviness of their conversation dissolving as easily as children's conversations often do, moving fluidly from profound questions about love and regret to practical concerns about poster board and glue. Edward agreed readily, grateful for the natural resilience that allowed his daughter to hold complicated truths without being permanently weighed down by them. When Charlotte arrived later that evening to collect Rosalind, Edward mentioned briefly, with Rosalind's permission, that they had discussed the history of the divorce for her school project. Charlotte's expression flickered with a brief moment of concern before Edward reassured her that the conversation had gone well, handled, he hoped, with the same careful balance of honesty and appropriate protection that she herself had always modeled throughout Rosalind's childhood. Charlotte thanked him quietly, and later that week, sent him a brief message letting him know that Rosalind's presentation had gone well, that her teacher had specifically praised the way she discussed her family's complicated history with maturity and honesty rather than shame or avoidance. Reading that message, Edward felt a quiet, settled satisfaction that had nothing to do with the dramatic emotional highs and lows that had characterized so much of the earlier years following the scandal. It was instead the simple, unglamorous satisfaction of a difficult job done reasonably well over a long period of consistent effort, the kind of quiet success that rarely made headlines or generated dramatic gossip, but that mattered infinitely more to the people actually living within its consequences. Years later, when Rosalind herself grew into an adult and eventually asked Edward, during a quiet conversation much like the one they had shared during her childhood homework assignment, what single lesson he most wanted her to carry forward from the complicated story of her parents' divorce, Edward answered without needing much time to consider his response. He told her that the most important lesson was not about avoiding mistakes entirely, since every person, regardless of their intentions, would inevitably fail the people they loved in some way at some point in their lives. The more important lesson, he explained, was about what happened afterward, whether a person chose to hide from the consequences of their failures through excuses and denial, or whether they chose instead to confront those failures honestly and rebuild themselves patiently, through consistent action rather than dramatic words, regardless of whether that rebuilding ever earned back everything that had been lost. Rosalind considered his answer carefully, much as she had considered every important conversation throughout her thoughtful, observant childhood, and told him quietly that she believed her mother had taught her a similar lesson from an entirely different angle, that true strength was not about avoiding heartbreak or betrayal entirely, but about facing it with clarity and self-respect rather than allowing anger or desperation to dictate every subsequent decision. Edward smiled at this, recognizing in his daughter's words the beautiful, balanced integration of everything both her parents had ultimately learned from the painful, transformative experience that had shaped the earliest, most vulnerable months of her existence, long before she had been old enough to remember any of it directly, yet somehow shaped by its lessons all the same.